July 12th, 1944, 2:17 p.m. Somewhere in the jungle hills east of Kohima, Burma, Captain Takeshi Yamamoto pressed his palm against the trunk of a teak tree, steadying himself as another wave of dizziness washed through him. The bark felt slick under his hand, coated with moisture from the monsoon that had begun 6 days earlier. Around him, the remnants of the 31st Division's 58th Regiment sprawled across the hillside in whatever shade they could find. The smell hit him before anything else. The rot of unwashed bodies, infected wounds wrapped in filthy bandages, dysentery, fear. Yamamoto counted heads without meaning to, a habit from before. 43 men visible from where he stood. His regiment had crossed the Chindwin River into India with 3,800 soldiers 4 months ago. The taste of metal filled his mouth, blood from gums weakened by malnutrition, and he spat into the undergrowth. Through the canopy above, rain began to fall again, heavy drops that hit the leaves like small fists, building to a roar that made thinking impossible. In his pack, wrapped in oilcloth that had stopped being waterproof weeks ago, General Kotoku Sato's final order to the division sat like a death sentence typed onto paper. Retreat to Thailand, maintain unit cohesion, estimated march duration 30 days. Yamamoto had calculated the distance that first night, tracing the route on a map that showed terrain, but not truth. 1,100 miles through roadless jungle, across rivers swollen by monsoon, over mountains that rose like walls, pursued by British forces and time itself. Before the sun set that evening, the first man in his regiment would die. If you want to hear how this story ends, make sure you're subscribed, because what happened next rewrote every assumption about human endurance and military disaster. The Japanese 31st Division's presence in those hills represented the final collapse of one of the most ambitious Japanese operations of World War II, Operation Yugo, Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi's attempt to invade India and capture the strategic cities of Imphal and Kohima. The 31st Division, known by its call sign as the Furious Division, had been raised in Bangkok in March 1943 from elements of the Kawaguchi Detachment and portions of 3 other divisions. Its commander, Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato, had opposed the operation from the beginning, considering Mutaguchi a blockhead and harboring grave misgivings about their chances. History would prove Sato devastatingly correct, but not before his division paid a price that would become one of the war's most horrific statistics. The Battle of Kohima, which the 31st Division had prosecuted from April through mid-May 1944, had devolved into a meat grinder that consumed Japanese forces at an unsustainable rate. By May 13th, British forces had retaken most of the Kohima region, and on May 15th, the 31st Division began its withdrawal under pursuit by the British 14th Army. What Sato understood, and what his superior Mutaguchi refused to acknowledge, was that the division was already shattered, not from enemy action primarily, but from starvation, disease, and the complete collapse of Japanese logistics. The Japanese 15th Army, to which the 31st Division belonged, had launched Operation Yugo with what British commanders would later describe as criminally inadequate supplies, gambling that they could capture British stores to sustain their advance. When that gamble failed, soldiers began starving even before the retreat began. The strategic situation facing the 31st Division in July 1944 was catastrophic in ways Tokyo could not or would not comprehend. The entire Japanese position in Burma had collapsed following the disastrous defeats at Imphal and Kohima. Operations that cost the Japanese 15th Army between 50 and 60,000 dead and over 100,000 total casualties, most from disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion. These were the greatest defeats in Japanese military history to that date. The monsoon, which arrived in full force in early May, transformed every river into a raging torrent, every trail into a mud channel, and every valley into a disease incubator. For the 31st Division, now ordered to retreat not just to Burma, but all the way to Thailand, the monsoon meant that the jungle itself would become a more lethal enemy than the British forces pursuing them. The human beings who began that march in early July represented what remained of approximately 6,000 soldiers from various units of the 31st Division that had been consolidated for the retreat. These were not the confident troops who had crossed into India 3 months earlier. They were walking skeletons, men who had not eaten a full meal in weeks, whose uniforms hung on frames that had lost 30, 40, sometimes 50 pounds. Malaria had infected more than half the division during the Kohima operations. Dysentery was endemic. Wounds from combat, some months old, had become infected in the humid jungle environment where nothing dried, nothing healed, and bacteria thrived. Medical supplies had run out in May. Officers carried sidearms with 1 or 2 remaining bullets. Infantrymen had perhaps 20 rifle rounds each, and many had abandoned their weapons entirely to save energy. Private Hiroshi Nakamura, 19 years old, from a rice farming family in Niigata Prefecture, wrote in a diary entry dated July 14th, 2 days into the march, "We are already dead. We walk, but we are already dead. The captain says Thailand in 1 month. No one believes this. I have eaten nothing but 3 handfuls of rice in 4 days. My boots fell apart yesterday. I wrapped them with vines, but the vines cut my feet, and now I cannot tell if I walk on feet or on stumps wrapped in blood." That diary, recovered by British forces months later from Nakamura's remains, would become one of the few primary source documents of the march. Its pages, stained with mud, blood, and mold, recorded a descent into hell that military historians would study for decades as perhaps the single worst non-combat military disaster in modern warfare. The terrain through which the 31st Division had to march existed in a category beyond difficult. Central Burma, where the march began, featured jungle so dense that sunlight reached the ground only in scattered patches. The trees grew 200 feet tall, their canopy forming a roof that held moisture like a sponge, creating a permanent twilight beneath. The undergrowth consisted of wait-a-minute vines with thorns that hooked into clothing and skin, bamboo thickets impenetrable without machetes, and ferns that concealed the ground so completely that every step was a gamble. Roots rose like tripwires. Holes hidden by vegetation could break an ankle or swallow a leg up to the knee. The only trails were animal tracks, paths made by elephants or tigers, twisting routes that followed the easiest terrain rather than any human destination. Between the jungle hills rose mountains, ranges that climbed 3, 4, 5,000 feet in ridges that ran north to south directly across the route the division needed to travel east. These were not the clean mountains of Japanese propaganda posters. They were razor ridges of limestone and shale, surfaces that crumbled underfoot, covered with vegetation that provided handholds until it didn't, until it pulled free and sent a man tumbling backwards down slopes so steep that falling meant not stopping. In the valleys between mountains ran rivers, waterways that during the dry season were fordable streams, but during monsoon became torrents 30 feet deep and 200 yards wide, moving with such force that a man swept into the current had no chance of reaching the far bank. The monsoon rain fell with intensity that men from temperate climates could not imagine until they experienced it. It was not the gentle rain of spring or even the hard rain of a thunderstorm. It was water falling as if poured from buckets, solid sheets of water that reduced visibility to 10 feet, that drummed on the jungle canopy so loudly that men could not hear each other shouting from arm's length apart. It fell for hours without pause, then stopped for minutes before resuming. Everything was wet, clothing never dried, boots filled with water that sloshed with each step. Skin became macerated, white and wrinkled, cracking into fissures that bled and infected. Fungal infections bloomed in armpits, groins, between toes. Leeches, fat and black, attached themselves to any exposed skin, and removing them left wounds that would not stop bleeding and almost always became infected. By day 5 of the march, July 16th, the first deaths occurred from cause other than combat wounds. Corporal Kenji Sato, 32 years old, a school teacher before the war, collapsed while climbing a ridge and could not be revived. His heart had simply stopped, exhausted beyond its capacity to continue. Private Ichiro Tanaka, 21, died of dysentery so severe that he had become too dehydrated to walk, his body shutting down organ by organ until nothing remained. Lance Corporal Masao Ito drowned crossing a river, swept away when his weakened arms could not hold the rope that other soldiers had strung across the current. His body was not recovered. These 3 deaths on a single day established a pattern that would accelerate with mathematical precision over the next 70 days. Captain Yamamoto understood within the first week that General Sato's 30-day estimate represented either criminal optimism or deliberate deception to prevent immediate mutiny. The division was making perhaps 8 miles per day on good days, 5 on bad days, sometimes 2 when terrain forced detours or rivers proved unfordable. 8 miles per day meant 137 days to cover 1,100 miles, and that assumed conditions remained constant rather than worsening. Yamamoto recalculated obsessively, trying different assumptions, but every calculation led to the same conclusion. Most of the division would die before reaching Thailand. He shared this information with no one, but he suspected every other officer had made similar calculations and reached similar conclusions. The command structure of the division began to fracture almost immediately. General Sato, who had repeatedly defied orders from General Mutaguchi during the Kohima battle by refusing to commit his men to suicidal attacks, and who had been relieved of command in early July and replaced by General Yuchitaru Kawada, was not present for the march. Kawada, arriving to command a division that existed more on paper than in reality, issued orders that assumed a functioning military unit rather than a collection of starving, disease-ridden men held together only by residual discipline and the knowledge that dispersing individually meant certain death. By day 15, July 26th, regimental commanders had stopped relaying orders from division headquarters and instead made decisions based on immediate survival. By day 20, company commanders operated independently, and by day 30, squad leaders made choices that officers would have called mutiny in any other context. The psychological impact of the march manifested in ways that shocked even veteran soldiers. Men who had fought bravely at Kohima, who had charged British positions knowing they would likely die, broke mentally when confronted with the jungle's indifferent malevolence. Some soldiers simply stopped walking, sitting down beside the trail, and refusing to move despite threats, pleas, or physical violence. Officers initially tried to force these men to continue, but after the first few days, they began leaving them behind. A man who stopped walking would be dead within hours anyway, from exposure, disease, or predators. Tigers stalked the columns, killing stragglers with efficiency that suggested they had learned to recognize easy prey. The screams of men taken by tigers in the night created panic that officers could barely contain. By day 20, August 1st, over 1,000 men from the original 6,000 had died. The march had transformed from a military retreat into a death march, whose pace was determined not by tactical considerations, but by the rate at which men could move before collapsing. The division had long since abandoned any pretense of maintaining combat readiness. Heavy weapons, machine guns, mortars, artillery pieces had been discarded within the first week. Officers had abandoned their ceremonial swords, symbols of samurai heritage that suddenly seemed absurd burdens when every ounce of weight mattered. Uniforms had been reduced to whatever remained after thorns shredded them, trousers torn off at the knees, shirts reduced to vests, boots replaced by bindings of bark and vine. Food, the central obsession of every waking moment, had become scarce beyond conception. The division's supply system, which had never functioned adequately even during active operations, had completely collapsed during the retreat. There were no supply columns following the march, no depots awaiting them, no friendly forces to provide resupply. Men ate anything that might provide calories. Roots dug from the ground, bark stripped from trees, leaves pulled from bushes, insects captured and eaten raw, worms pulled from rotting logs. Some of these were edible, providing barely enough energy to justify the effort of gathering them. Some were poisonous, causing vomiting, diarrhea, convulsions, death. Men learned to test unfamiliar plants by rubbing them on skin to check for reactions, but starvation often overrode caution, and soldiers would eat anything in desperation, gambling that nutrition would arrive before toxins killed. Private Nakamura's diary entry for August 5th, day 25, reads, "Found mushrooms growing on fallen tree. 6 of us ate them. Within 2 hours, Taniguchi was dead, convulsing until blood came from his mouth. Watanabe died an hour later. The rest of us vomited for hours but lived. I cannot describe the despair of being so hungry that you eat something knowing it might kill you, then watching it kill others, then being grateful it was not you. We are becoming animals, worse than animals. Animals do not know despair. Water, paradoxically, was both everywhere and dangerous. The jungle streams, beautiful and clear-looking, contained parasites that cause dysentery, amoebic infections, and diseases for which the division's medical officers had no names and no treatments. Officers initially ordered men to boil water before drinking, but fires were difficult to start with wet wood, required time the march could not spare, and produced smoke that might attract British pursuit forces. Within 2 weeks, men were drinking directly from streams, knowing the water would sicken them, but unable to resist the immediate need for hydration. The resulting diseases spread through the division like wildfire through dry grass, though nothing in the jungle was dry. Dysentery became so widespread that the march had to halt every few miles to allow men to relieve themselves, squatting in the undergrowth, passing blood and mucus, their bodies consuming themselves from within. Malaria, endemic to the region, infected soldiers in waves. The fever would spike suddenly, sending men into shaking chills despite the jungle's heat, then burning with temperatures that caused hallucinations and delirium. Without quinine, which the division's medical supplies had exhausted in June, treatment consisted of trying to keep fevered men hydrated and cool, an impossible task in the monsoon jungle. Many men with malaria simply disappeared from the column, wandering off during delirium, never to be seen again. Their bodies would be found occasionally by soldiers who followed, identifiable by rotted uniforms, but more often they simply vanished into the jungle that consumed everything. Infected wounds became the third major killer after starvation and disease. Every cut, scrape, leech bite, and thorn scratch became a potential death sentence in the jungle's bacterial paradise. Without antiseptics, antibiotics, or clean bandages, infections progressed rapidly from local inflammation to spreading cellulitis to systemic sepsis. Men would notice a small wound on their foot or hand, ignore it because they had a dozen others, and within 3 days be unable to walk from the swelling. Within a week, they would be delirious with fever. Within 10 days, they would be dead. The division's medical officers, themselves sick and starving, could do nothing except watch men die from infections that would have been trivial to treat with proper supplies. By day 40, August 20th, the division had dissolved as a coherent military unit. What remained were clusters of men moving in the same general direction, groups of 10 or 20 soldiers who stayed together through friendship, shared desperation, or simply because they had not yet become separated. Communication between these groups was sporadic. Some bands included officers who maintained discipline through force of personality or residual respect for rank. Other groups had no officers, the commanders having died or been abandoned, and operated under informal leadership of whoever had the strength and will to make decisions. Still other soldiers moved alone, whether by choice or circumstance. Silent figures who appeared occasionally on the trail, exchanged no words, and disappeared again into the jungle. The descent into cannibalism, though never officially documented by Japanese military authorities, was reported by survivors in classified post-war interrogations and by Allied intelligence officers who encountered evidence during subsequent operations in the region. Private Nakamura's diary does not mention cannibalism directly, but an entry from August 23rd hints at horrors he could not bring himself to describe explicitly. Found Sergeant Ono and 3 men from 2nd Squad. They had killed Corporal Yamada. His body was being used for food. Ono said nothing when we discovered them. We said nothing. We moved on. What are we now? What have we become? Allied forces entering the area months later would discover human remains with knife marks on bones, evidence of butchery that suggested systematic meat harvesting rather than desperate, isolated incidents. Officers, once the embodiment of imperial Japanese military tradition, began killing themselves as their authority and purpose evaporated. Captain Yamamoto, who had led his regiment's survivors with grim determination through the first month of the march, shot himself on August 28th after his men ignored his orders to maintain the column and scattered to search for food. His body was found beside the trail 2 days later by another group, his pistol still in his hand, a single bullet hole in his temple. His death was neither notable nor unique. Dozens of officers committed suicide during the march, unable to reconcile their training, which emphasized duty, honor, and command responsibility, with the reality that they commanded corpses in waiting and that no amount of duty or honor could make their men strong enough to continue. Some officers, rather than kill themselves, killed their men first. Desertion, though meaningless in a jungle where leaving the column meant death from different causes rather than survival, became common enough that some commanders attempted to enforce discipline through execution. Soldiers who stopped walking, who refused orders, who tried to leave the column, would be shot by officers who believed maintaining discipline mattered even as everything else fell apart. These executions, witnessed by Private Nakamura and recorded in his diary with numb horror, achieved nothing except adding to the death toll. The men being shot were going to die anyway, within hours or days. Shooting them simply expedited the inevitable and eliminated any possibility, however slim, that rest might allow them to recover enough to continue. By day 60, September 9th, the remnants of the 31st Division had been reduced to perhaps 200 men still walking. They were unrecognizable as human beings in any meaningful sense. Their faces were skull-like, skin stretched tight over bone, eyes sunken into dark hollows. Their bodies were skeletal, ribs visible through skin, arms and legs reduced to sticks wrapped in flesh. They moved with the shuffling gait of the elderly, each step requiring conscious effort, their bodies so depleted that walking in a straight line was impossible. They stank with a smell that combined rotting flesh, infected wounds, dysentery, and something else, the smell of bodies consuming themselves from inside. The average soldier still walking at day 60 had lost more than 70 pounds from his starting weight. Men who had weighed 160 pounds in March weighed 90 pounds in September. At that level of emaciation, the human body has begun cannibalizing muscle tissue to maintain basic organ function. The heart weakens, the immune system collapses, the brain loses capacity for complex thought. Men at this stage of starvation experience constant cold, even in tropical heat, because their bodies lack the energy to maintain normal temperature. They develop edema, swelling in the legs and abdomen from fluid accumulation, which creates the grotesque paradox of appearing bloated while actually starving. Their wounds stop healing entirely because the body has no resources to spare for tissue repair. The final 2 weeks of the march from day 60 to day 74 represented a race between the survivors' remaining strength and the distance to Thailand. The terrain had begun to change as the division descended from the central Burmese highlands toward the Thai border. The mountains became less steep, the jungle less dense, and for the first time in 2 months, soldiers occasionally glimpsed open sky. These signs that they were approaching civilization should have provided encouragement, but most men were too far gone to care. They walked because walking was what they had been doing, a habit sustained by muscle memory rather than conscious will. Private Nakamura's final diary entry, dated September 19th, day 70, reads, "Thailand is close. Lieutenant Saito says 3 days. I do not think I will make 3 days. Cannot remember when I last ate. Tried to write yesterday, but hand would not work. Writing now because if I die today, someone should know we were here. Someone should know what happened. 6,000 of us began this march. I have seen perhaps 15 others in the past 2 days. Where are the rest? Dead in the jungle, dead in rivers, dead from disease, from starvation, from giving up. The lieutenant says we are heroes, that we performed our duty. I do not feel like a hero. I feel like a ghost who has not yet realized he is dead." Nakamura survived to reach Thailand, one of the 47 who did, but died 2 weeks later from dysentery and complications from malnutrition. On September 23, 1944, 74 days after beginning the march from central Burma, 47 soldiers from the Japanese 31st Division staggered into a Japanese base camp on the Thai border. The camp's commanding officer initially refused to believe these skeletal figures were soldiers, thinking them civilians fleeing the war, or perhaps prisoners who had escaped. When they identified themselves and their unit, the officer was horrified. He had received notice weeks earlier to expect the 31st Division, but anticipated a functional military unit, perhaps depleted but still organized. Instead, he faced what looked like concentration camp survivors, men who could barely stand, who had lost so much weight their uniforms hung on them like robes, whose eyes held nothing but exhausted relief at having stopped walking. Medical personnel who examined the survivors documented physical conditions that challenged medical understanding. The average weight loss among the 47 survivors was 71 pounds. Several men weighed less than 80 pounds. All showed signs of advanced malnutrition, including muscle wasting, edema, and organ dysfunction. Every survivor had malaria, most had dysentery, and many had infected wounds months old that had never healed. 12 of the 47 would die within the next month despite receiving medical care, their bodies too damaged to recover. The remaining 35 survived physically but carried psychological scars that never healed. The mathematics of the march were almost incomprehensible. 6,000 soldiers had begun the retreat in early July. 47 reached Thailand in late September. That represented a 99.2% casualty rate from a non-combat operation, a retreat through terrain rather than a battle against enemy forces. To put this in perspective, military operations that result in 30% casualties are considered catastrophic. Operations with 50% casualties is rare enough to be studied as exceptional disasters. A 99.2% casualty rate existed in a category for which military terminology had no adequate description. Post-war investigations attempted to account for the missing 5,953 men. Recovery teams found approximately 1,700 bodies along the march route, identifiable by remains of uniforms, equipment, or identification tags. These were soldiers who had died and been left beside the trail, their bodies quickly consumed by jungle scavengers and decomposition. The remaining 4,200 men were never recovered. They died in locations that were never found, swept away by rivers, taken by predators and scattered, or simply absorbed into the jungle and lost forever. The jungles of central Burma still contain their remains, bones scattered under vegetation, slowly consumed by the forest that killed them. The Japanese military classified the march as a strategic redeployment, bureaucratic language that transformed catastrophe into routine logistics. Official reports mentioned difficult conditions and higher than anticipated losses, but never acknowledged the operation for what it was, a death march that killed 99% of the men ordered to execute it. Survivors who were interviewed after the war, in classified sessions whose transcripts remain sealed for decades, described the march in terms that varied from clinical detachment to barely controlled rage. Some blamed the terrain, some blamed lack of supplies, but most blamed the command structure that ordered 6,000 starving, disease-ridden men to march 1,100 miles through roadless jungle during monsoon season and called it a feasible military operation. The survivors, all 47 of them, gave the march a name that never appeared in official documents, but circulated among Japanese veterans as a whispered legend. They called it the march that death forgot to finish. The phrase captured something essential about the experience, the sense that they had all died during those 74 days, but their bodies had not realized it yet, that they had been walking corpses sustained by nothing but the momentum of putting one foot in front of the other. That 47 had somehow survived seemed less like luck than like an oversight, as if death had been so busy harvesting the other 6,000 that it had simply missed a few stragglers. The psychological impact on the survivors manifested in ways that military psychiatrists, primitive as that field was in 1944, could barely comprehend. Men who had survived the march could not speak about it without breaking down. Nightmares were universal and permanent. Many survivors refused to eat adequately even when food was abundant, as if their bodies no longer remembered how. Some became obsessively fearful of rain, having panic attacks when monsoon storms began. Others could not tolerate being in enclosed spaces, needing to see the sky because the jungle canopy had created a sense of being buried alive. These psychological wounds never healed because the men could never reconcile what they had experienced with any framework of meaning that made sense. The strategic impact of the 31st Division's destruction was minimal because the division had already been effectively eliminated as a fighting force before the retreat began. The Battle of Kohima and the larger Imphal operation had destroyed the Japanese 15th Army as a coherent military organization. The 31st Division's march to Thailand changed nothing about the war's outcome. It did not delay Allied advances, did not tie up enemy resources, did not serve any tactical or strategic purpose. It was purely a retreat, an attempt to move soldiers from one location to another that became a catastrophe through the combination of impossible terrain, inadequate preparation, and command decisions that prioritized organizational concerns over the reality of what was being asked of already broken men. British forces pursuing the Japanese retreat discovered evidence of the march's horror. Patrols following the trail found bodies, abandoned equipment, and scenes that suggested the dissolution of military discipline and the descent into desperate survival measures. One British officer's report, filed in October 1944, described finding at a campsite where human remains showed evidence of butchery, surrounded by the remnants of Japanese uniforms and equipment. "We have found evidence of what can only be described as cannibalism," the report stated. "The Japanese forces in retreat have been reduced to conditions I cannot adequately describe. This is not an army retreating, it is a death march proceeding." Allied intelligence officers who analyzed the 31st Division's march drew conclusions that influenced subsequent operations. They realized that destroying Japanese supply lines was more effective than engaging them in direct combat. A Japanese unit without food would eliminate itself through attrition more efficiently than any Allied attack could achieve. This lesson informed Allied strategy in the final year of the Burma campaign, where cutting Japanese logistics became a priority equal to seizing terrain. The march also demonstrated to Allied commanders that Japanese soldiers, despite their reputation for fanatical resistance, were human beings subject to the same physical limitations as any other soldiers. Starvation, disease, and exhaustion would break Japanese units as surely as they broke any other army, though perhaps the breaking took longer because of training that emphasized duty over self-preservation. For the Japanese military command, the 31st Division's destruction represented an embarrassing failure that was buried in classification and bureaucracy. General Mutaguchi, whose decision to launch Operation Yugo had led to the entire catastrophe, was relieved of command and sent into retirement. General Kawabe, who commanded Burma Area Army, was similarly removed. But no official inquiry investigated why 6,000 men had been ordered to march through impossible terrain without adequate supplies. No court-martial examined the command decisions that had led to a 99.2% casualty rate. The Japanese military simply classified the records, filed them away, and never spoke of it again. The families of the men who died on the march received notification that their sons, husbands, and fathers had been killed in action in Burma. That phrase, technically accurate since the men died during military operations, concealed the truth that most had died not from enemy action, but from starvation, disease, exhaustion, or suicide. The distinction mattered to the soldiers who experienced it, mattered profoundly, because dying in combat implied purpose and meaning, while dying of dysentery in a jungle implied waste and futility. But for the families receiving notification, the distinction was never revealed. They buried empty caskets, honored their dead as fallen warriors, and never learned that their loved ones had died in a retreat that served no purpose except to move broken men from one place to another through terrain that killed them more efficiently than any enemy could. The few survivors who lived long enough to see Japan's surrender in 1945 rarely spoke about the march. Some wrote private memoirs that circulated among veteran groups but were never published. Others testified in classified military inquiries, but under conditions that guaranteed their stories would remain secret. A handful gave interviews to historians decades later, old men recounting events from their youth with voices that still carried the weight of trauma. These interviews, collected in Japanese military archives and some translated for Western historians, provide the primary source material for understanding what happened during those 74 days. One survivor, Corporal Masato Kobayashi, interviewed in 1985 at age 63, said, "Every day I wake up grateful to be alive and guilty that I survived when 5,000 others did not. I have spent 40 years asking why I lived. I was not stronger, not smarter, not more determined than the men who died. I simply kept walking when others could not. That is not heroism. That is luck, if luck is the right word for being chosen at random to survive a massacre. Sometimes I think the men who died were the lucky ones. They are at peace. I have lived with what I saw, what I did, what I became during that march. That is its own kind of death, slower but just as certain. The jungle that consumed the 31st Division has changed little in the 80 years since. The trees still grow 200 feet tall, the monsoon still falls with crushing force, the rivers still rage during the rainy season. The trails the division followed have long since vanished, reclaimed by vegetation. The locations where men died are unmarked and unknown. No memorial stands to the 5,953 soldiers who began a march and never finished it. Their bones lie scattered in the jungle, if they remain at all, slowly consumed by the soil and the relentless growth of a forest that preserves nothing. For military historians, the march represents a case study in catastrophic logistics and the limits of human endurance. It appears in military academy curricula as an example of what not to do, a cautionary tale about the importance of supply planning and the dangers of asking impossible tasks of soldiers. For medical professionals, the survivor's condition provided data on extreme malnutrition and its effects, information that was used in understanding and treating famine victims and concentration camp survivors after the war. For psychologists, the trauma experienced by survivors contributed to early understanding of what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder, though that terminology did not exist in 1944. But for the men who marched and for the families of those who died, it was none of these academic categories. It was 74 days of suffering that defied description, death that came in thousands of individual moments of private horror, and a collective trauma that could never be adequately expressed in words. It was fathers who never returned home, sons whose bodies were never recovered, brothers whose final days remained forever unknown. It was 47 men who survived something that should have killed them all, and who lived the rest of their lives carrying the weight of 5,953 ghosts. The final accounting of the march reads like a mathematical proof of human fragility. 6,000 soldiers ordered to march 1,100 miles. 74 days of walking through jungle and mountains during monsoon season. 5,953 men dead from starvation, disease, exhaustion, exposure, accidents, suicide, and murder. 47 survivors, 12 of those dying within a month of reaching safety, 35 living to see Japan surrender 9 months later, all of them carrying psychological wounds that never healed. The numbers tell a story of institutional failure, of command decisions made without regard for physical reality, of men ordered to do the impossible and dying when they could not achieve it. The Japanese 31st Division's march from Burma to Thailand stands as one of the most horrific non-combat military disasters in modern history, not because it was unique in kind, but because it was extreme in degree. Other armies have suffered catastrophic retreats. Other units have been destroyed by the terrain and weather. But few, if any, military operations have achieved a 99.2% casualty rate without enemy action, and fewer still have done so while maintaining the pretense that this was a planned, strategic redeployment rather than a death march. That distinction matters because it reveals something about the nature of military bureaucracy and institutional denial. It was easier for the Japanese military to classify the march as a strategic operation that encountered difficulty than to acknowledge that they had killed 6,000 of their own soldiers through incompetence and impossible orders. The legacy of the march lives on in ways both documented and intangible. The documented legacy consists of the archives, the survivor testimonies, the historical analyses, and the academic studies. The intangible legacy consists of the silence, the absence of 6,000 men who should have returned home but did not, the families who never learned the truth of how their loved ones died, and the survivors who could never adequately explain what they had experienced. It lives in the nightmares of men who are now all dead, in the memories they could not share, in the guilt they carried for surviving when others did not. In the broader context of World War II, the 31st Division's march barely registers. It was a minor event in a campaign that was itself considered secondary to the main theaters in Europe and the Pacific. The Burma campaign, though important strategically, never captured public attention the way other operations did. The 31st Division's disaster was one among many, lost in the larger narrative of Japanese defeat and Allied victory. But for the 6,000 men who began that march, and for the 47 who finished it, it was not a minor event or a footnote. It was everything. It was the end of 5,953 lives and the permanent scarring of 47 others. It was 74 days that contained more suffering than most people experience in a lifetime. It was a march that death forgot to finish, leaving just enough survivors to bear witness to what happened when an army asked the impossible of soldiers who were already broken. The jungle between Burma and Thailand became a graveyard with no markers, a killing field where nature itself was the executioner. As the march entered its final weeks, the survivors moved through a landscape littered with the evidence of their division's destruction. Bodies lay beside the trail every few hundred yards, some fresh enough to still be recognizable, others reduced to bones and rotted cloth. Equipment abandoned in the early days, heavy weapons and artillery pieces, was now joined by rifles, helmets, and personal items, the possessions of men who no longer had the strength to carry even the weight of identity. The psychological transformation of the survivors was complete by day 60. They had ceased being soldiers in any meaningful sense. They were walking corpses animated by nothing but the involuntary continuation of movement, feet that kept shuffling forward because stopping meant admitting death. They did not speak to each other except in grunts and gestures. Eye contact was avoided because seeing the horror in another man's face meant confronting their own condition. Some men developed a 1,000-yard stare, eyes focused on nothing, minds retreated to places where the jungle could not reach them. Others descended into a kind of waking dream state, hallucinating family members walking beside them, conversations with the dead, visions of food and safety that evaporated when they tried to grasp them. The final stretch to Thailand should have provided hope, but for most survivors it simply meant more walking through more jungle toward a destination that had ceased to have meaning. Several men died within sight of the Thai border, their bodies collapsing on trails that would have led them to safety if they had managed just a few more miles. These deaths seemed particularly cruel, suggesting that survival was determined not by strength or will, but by pure random chance, by whether a man's heart stopped on this side of an invisible line or the other. When the 47 survivors finally reached the Japanese base camp on September 23, 1944, they were greeted not with celebration but with stunned horror. The camp commander, Lieutenant Colonel Ishida, had been warned to expect depleted forces, but nothing had prepared him for what actually arrived. These were not soldiers. They were animated skeletons, men whose bodies had consumed themselves from inside, whose eyes held a blankness that suggested they had seen things that erased whatever had made them human. Several collapsed immediately upon arrival, their bodies finally permitting an unconsciousness now that the need to keep walking had ended. Others stood swaying, unable to process that they had actually stopped, that the march was over, that they had somehow survived. Medical examinations revealed conditions so extreme they challenged medical understanding. The average survivor weighed 89 pounds. Their bodies showed signs of protein deficiency so severe that organs had begun to fail. Livers were enlarged and dysfunctional. Hearts had developed arrhythmias from electrolyte imbalances. Kidneys were shutting down. Immune systems had collapsed, leaving them vulnerable to every infection. The doctors treating them understood that even with intensive care, many would die, their bodies too damaged to recover regardless of how much food or medicine they received. 12 of the 47 died within 30 days of reaching Thailand, despite receiving medical treatment, adequate food, and shelter. Their bodies had been pushed beyond the point where recovery was possible. They died quietly, in hospital beds, surrounded by medical personnel who could do nothing except make them comfortable. These deaths hit the survivors particularly hard because they had seemed to violate the implicit promise that reaching Thailand meant safety. The men had endured 74 days of hell, believing that survival meant making it to the border. Learning that making it to the border still might not be enough was a final cruelty that some survivors never emotionally recovered from. The 35 who survived past that first month carried physical and psychological scars that defined the rest of their lives. All suffered chronic health problems, malaria that recurred annually, digestive systems permanently damaged by dysentery and malnutrition, hearts weakened by the strain. But the psychological damage ran deeper than any physical wound. They could not speak about the march without breaking down. Nightmares plagued them for decades. Dreams of walking through endless jungle, of watching friends die, of the moment they realized they might not survive. Many developed survivor's guilt so profound it bordered on mental illness, obsessively asking why they had lived when 5,953 others had died. The Japanese government never officially acknowledged what happened to the 31st Division. The march was classified as a strategic withdrawal with casualties due to difficult terrain and weather conditions. No investigation was conducted into the command decisions that had led to the disaster. No officer was court-martialed for ordering starving, disease-ridden men to march 1,100 miles through impossible terrain. The families of the dead received standard notifications of killed in action that provided no details about how or where their loved ones had actually died. This official silence meant that the true story of the march remained hidden for decades, known only to the handful of survivors and the military officials who classified the records. In the broader sweep of World War II history, the 31st Division's march represents a footnote, a minor disaster in a war filled with catastrophes. But for understanding the limits of human endurance and the consequences of military hubris, it stands as one of history's most profound lessons. 6,000 men were ordered to do something physically impossible. 5,953 died trying. 47 survived by luck, genetics, or some combination of factors that defied analysis. The march achieved nothing strategically, saved no lives, served no tactical purpose. It was purely waste, human life expended for no reason except that orders had been given, and soldiers were expected to obey them regardless of whether the orders made sense. Today, the jungle between Burma and Thailand still holds the remains of those 5,953 men. Their bones lie scattered under vegetation, in rivers, on mountainsides, in locations that will never be found. No memorial marks their passing. No monument lists their names. They are simply gone, erased from the physical world as completely as if they had never existed. The only evidence they were ever there consists of survivor testimonies, classified military documents, and the occasional discovery of remains by villagers or researchers who stumble across bones and rotted equipment in the forest. The survivors called it the march that death forgot to finish, and that phrase captures something essential about what happened. 6,000 men entered the jungle in July 1944. Death took 99.2% of them over 74 days. That it missed 47 seemed less like victory than like oversight, as if death had been so thorough in its harvest that a few stragglers had slipped through unnoticed. Those 47 spent the rest of their lives wondering why they had been spared, unable to find meaning in survival when so many others had died. They were not heroes, they insisted in interviews decades later. They were simply the ones who had kept walking when others could not.